Hello, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to paint a gorgeous earth because it's Earth Day. We only need 3 colors for this painting. We need sap green, lemon yellow and turquoise, or any type of light blue color you may have. For the outline I just used a plate and then I downloaded a picture of the planet Earth. I drew the continents on there with a pencil. They are really light lines and they are just a guideline for me. The background will be painted using the wet and wet method. I wet in the page and then I drop in some paint and let the paint disperse naturally. I can help it to move a little with a brush. Once all the paint is on the paper, I will drop in some salt and I will also leave some water splatters on it because it will leave a really cool pattern once it's dry. You can totally skip the salt part. As you can see here, I mop up any puddles with a dry brush or a paper towel because it will leave really weird patterns. Especially towards the edges, I make sure to mop up any puddles. You do not really need to tape this painting down, but I did it anyways because I tend to move it out of frame when I paint. I painted the background in 2 sections, first the left side and then the right side, just because the paper dries pretty fast and it's easier to do it this way. As long as the paint is still wet, you can always go back in and leave some more watermarks or water splatters on it. Once the painting is completely dry, I can simply brush off the salt. I will also be correcting some of the lines that did not come out as straight as expected. To correct them, I loosen the paint with a moist brush and I simply soak it up with a paper towel. Certain colors like ultramarine blue can stain the page, so you cannot really remove them. But it's not a big deal as there will be a second layer of color on this painting anyway, so don't worry about it. My main goal is to not have any hard edges there, as they will be visible in the next layer of paint and they will be an eyesore in the final painting. The water is painted in using the wet and wet method as well, but the pigment I'm using is a little more dense. It's not as diluted as the blue I used for the background. I pre-wetten the paper section by section and then I'm just going around the whole painting around all the edges, creating hard edges in the painting. The paint will bleed towards the center of the oceans and it will leave a really cool pattern because it will look patchy and uneven. I want as much movement as possible with this painting. But whenever there's a puddle forming, I just use a paper towel to soak up some of the water. If you leave puddles on your paper, they will leave stains and marks in the final painting because they will stay wet significantly longer than the rest of the painting. You cannot control those marks and those patterns. Even though they can look really cool, I do really want to have control over my watermarks with this painting. Once some of the pigment dispersed in an area, I drop in some water to leave really cool watermarks. Those blooms look amazing in this painting. The great color variation will make it look really cool and really interesting. And all I need to achieve this really is one single watercolor paint, the blue pigment. I mix it in different densities with different amounts of water mixed into it to give it this really cool look. I can create those blooms with water or even with the blue pigment. Whatever it takes to create a really visually interesting painting. Once all of the blue oceans are painted in, I let the painting dry completely, which can take anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, depending on the outside temperature, the temperature in your house, or even depending on the moisture in the air in your home. If you want to intensify the color in an area, you need to make sure that you pre-wet that area and pre-wet a wider area around it so that you do not accidentally create any hard edges. Some of the salt from earlier got stuck under the tape that I used to tape down the painting on my table, so I just remove it. It just keeps getting stuck on my hand now. I think the whole painting will look better if I take my time in between the different layers to clean up some of those edges that did not come out as straight or round as I wanted them to be. For the continents, I mixed some sap green with lemon yellow just to brighten up the color. And I'm using that mix to use the wet in wet method and paint in all of the continents. There's a different amount of the green or yellow in my brush at any given time, which just makes it look even more interesting. Mixing some of the lemon yellow in the paint will make the paint literally glow. I'm making my life easier here by turning the page. It's a great method to be able to accurately reach every place of your painting without touching any of the other wet areas. It just saves me time because I do not need to wait any drying time. For the countenance, I'm using the same method as before. I first wetten the page, then I drop in the pigment, and then I drop in some water or even some drops of pigment to make it look more interesting and create some blooms. I can drop the water in or the pigment as long as the paint on the page is still wet or even damp. The cauliflowers that I create this way by dropping in the water at different stages of the drying process, they will just look different and very unique. And don't forget to paint in the little islands as well. The painting I originally planned is basically done now, but I decided that I would really like to add a flower wreath to it, just a really simple one. I'm using the same colors here that I used for the painting to make the whole thing look cohesive. The flower will have 5 petals. Each petal is painted in with 2 brush strokes. If the petals are touching in the center, don't worry about it. At this point, I do try to make them look a bit more interesting in color by dropping in some more intense pigment towards the center and let it bleed outwards. But it didn't really show once the flower was dry, so I will be changing plans later. I'm also going to add a second flower, which is sitting behind the main flower. And I'm doing that with a blue color as well, but it's more diluted, so there's more water added to the color. The branches I'm painting in right now are painted in with a really light wash. They will appear at distance and in the background later, because the wash is so light. Later on, I will be using a more intense pigment to paint other branches over them. The branches I'm painting right now are really simple. I draw one line as the stick, and then I draw a couple leaves on each of the sticks. The leaves are painted in really easy with 1 or 2 brush strokes. The tip of the brush is touching the original stick, and as I pull my brush outwards, I'm pushing the brush down to spread out the bristles. This light layer of pigment will dry pretty fast. Once it's dry, I can go in with my brush again and the same pigment or a different color even, and I will have more watercolor, more pigment added to the water, so it will be less diluted. And I just paint a couple of branches on top of the previous ones. They will look more in the foreground. This gives the whole wreath a really great color variation, and I think it looks really cool. But it also looks very cohesive because I'm reusing the same colors that I used for the painting. Since the original flower did not turn out the way I wanted it to be, I go over the whole flower again and just paint over it again with the same blue color. I'm correcting some of the outer lines as I do that, and I just intensify the color and I even out the color. In addition, I will be adding a few more details with the blue pigment to the wreath. It will just be a couple of small blossoms, blooms, but you could also add some dots or whatever you feel would make your painting look more interesting. Reusing the blue pigment here will make the painting look more interesting and more cohesive. The wreath was kind of boring without those blue segments, without those blue blossoms. You can easily change the whole flower wreath by adding a few more branches. I realized that my flower element didn't really go around the earth, and I just decided to add another branch there to make it embrace the earth, instead of just being a random flower wreath next to it. Once this flower wreath is completely dry, I can use some gouache to add some details to the center of the blossoms. If the watercolor is not completely dry yet, or even if you scrub too much, the gouache will mix with the pigment from the watercolor and the white details will turn blue. So really try to avoid that. For the flower in the back, I just mixed a little bit of water into the gouache to make it a bit more translucent and use that to add a few details to the flower that's sitting in the back. I tend to go overboard with details, which is really not necessary here, so even some simple dots in the center of the flower would be good enough. I really hope you enjoyed painting with me today. If you liked my video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and leave me a comment and let me know what else you would like me to paint for you.